Hello again. If you are here, you are in the right place tonight. Turn the lamp down to whatever light still lets you find the edge of the blanket, and no further. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they have been living all day, somewhere up near your ears. We are not going anywhere tonight. That is the whole point of this hour. We are going to sit still and let a single morning, in a single room, in a single life, come to us slowly, the way fog comes over a valley, until we are standing inside it without quite remembering how we got there. Tonight that room is in Pasadena, California, in the autumn of 1958. It is a room full of women at wooden desks, and on each desk sits a machine the size of a small suitcase, full of steel gears that turn when you pull a lever, and the whole room hums and clicks and clatters like 100 quiet typewriters. Down the hall, a teletype machine is printing numbers that came from a radar dish 4,000 miles away. Somewhere above the building, past the tile roofs and the dry hills, there is a rocket being prepared that will try, in a matter of days, to leave the Earth's gravity entirely and reach the moon. Almost nobody watching that rocket lift off will ever learn the names of the people who told it, sentence by sentence, in pencil, exactly where to go. We are going to spend this evening with one of those people. Her name, for our purposes, is Louise, and she has a sharpened pencil, a cardigan buttoned against the morning chill, and 8 hours of arithmetic ahead of her that will help decide whether a piece of American machinery makes it past the moon or misses it by 100,000 miles. If you are in bed already good, pull the blanket up to wherever it feels right, and let your hands go loose at your sides. The way they go loose just before sleep actually arrives, before you notice it happening. If you are somewhere else, a chair, a couch, a car seat, waiting out a long drive, that is fine too. History does not require a bed to be told properly. It only requires a little quiet and the willingness to let one evening, decades gone now, become more real to you for the next while than the room you are actually sitting in. Get comfortable. There is nowhere else you need to be. Let us begin. If you asked most people what a NASA scientist looked like in the autumn of 1958, they would likely describe a man, probably in a white shirt and a narrow black tie, standing at a bank of dials in a room full of cigarette smoke, watching a screen while a rocket climbs. That picture is not wrong, exactly. It is simply incomplete, and it leaves out the room where most of the actual thinking happened. Tonight, we are going to follow a woman we are calling Louise Whitfield through a single ordinary working day at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the hills above Pasadena in October of 1958. Louise is what her employer calls, on her paycheck stub and in the official staff directory, a computer. Not a machine. A woman. Her job title is her job description. She computes. By hand, with a pencil and a mechanical calculator and a green-ruled ledger book, she performs the arithmetic that turns raw tracking data into a predicted path through space. The kind of work that a modern viewer would hand to a laptop in half a second without a second thought. The version of this story most people carry, if they carry any version at all, ends at the launch pad. Men in narrow ties, a countdown, a puff of smoke and a long white trail rising into blue sky. That version is not fiction. But it starts the story roughly 3 weeks too late, and it leaves an entire building and an entire category of worker completely out of the frame. Before we go any further, if the kind of evening where a fire crackles somewhere just out of frame and history gets told slowly without hurry happens to be your kind of evening, I would be glad if you considered subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it means we get to keep doing this. Keep finding these rooms and these people and bringing them back for an hour or two. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments what city you are listening from tonight and what time it reads on your own clock right now. I read every one of them, usually the next morning with coffee, and it is a small, strange pleasure to picture all those different clocks all showing different hours while the same story plays in all your ears. Wherever your clock says it is right now, I am glad you are spending part of it here. By the end of tonight, you will understand something about the space age that the countdown clocks and the newsreel footage never told you, which is that it did not begin with a roar. It began with the scratch of a soft pencil against ruled paper in a quiet room at 7:30 in the morning, before anyone outside that room had any idea a rocket was involved at all. It is 7:30 on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October 1958. The sun has just cleared the ridge of the San Gabriel Mountains, and the light coming down into the Arroyo Seco is a pale gold, the kind you only get in a Southern California autumn, the kind of light that has not yet decided whether the day will be warm or merely bright. Let us go there now. Pasadena in 1958 is a city still deciding what it wants to be. There are streets a few blocks from the center of town where orange groves still stand, gnarled trees planted before the First War, heavy with fruit nobody has picked yet. And there are other streets, newer ones, where those same groves were bulldozed the year before to make room for ranch houses with attached garages and young lawns still thin enough to see the dirt through. The air carries both smells at once if the wind is right. Citrus blossom, faint and sweet, and underneath it the mineral smell of fresh poured concrete and cut lumber. The smell of a place being built twice over, once as an old town and once as a new one, with neither version finished. This is a city that already knows how to put itself on display once a year, every New Year's morning, when the streets downtown fill with flower-covered floats and marching bands for a parade that has, by 1958, been running for nearly 70 years. Drawing visitors from across the country to watch roses arranged into shapes no rose ever grew into on its own. The rest of the year, Pasadena settles back into something quieter. A town of tree-lined streets and craftsman bungalows built at the turn of the century by families who came west for their health and stayed for the climate, sitting now beside the newer, plainer, tract houses, spreading out toward the edges of town. Colorado Street runs straight through the middle of it all, lined with department stores and drugstores and a movie palace with its marquee lit even in the late afternoon. And if you stand on that street at the right hour, you can watch two different decades of architecture facing each other across the same sidewalk, neither one quite ready to give way to the other. The California Institute of Technology sits a short drive south of the laboratory, a campus of Spanish-tiled roofs and shaded walkways that has, for more than 3 decades now, supplied the laboratory with its engineers, its administrators, and the loose institutional oversight that keeps the whole operation running under an Army contract without technically being an Army base. It was Caltech graduate students, in fact the very same ones who once got themselves banished from the main campus for the noise of their rocket experiments, who founded the laboratory in the canyon in the first place. And the relationship between the university downtown and the laboratory in the hills remains close enough that professors still walk the gravel paths here from time to time, checking on projects they help design and rarely so much as glancing toward the computing section as they pass. At the laboratory's gate itself, the same guard has been checking badges most mornings for almost as long as Louise has worked here, a heavy-set, unhurried man named Grady who came out of the Army with a bad knee and a preference for quiet mornings, and who has developed a habit of nodding at each woman from the computing section by a small private signal only the regulars would notice. 2 fingers touched briefly to the brim of his cap. Nothing so formal as a salute, but more than the flat nod he gives to visitors he does not recognize. Grady has never once asked Louise what exactly she does inside that plain wooden building, and Louise has never quite volunteered it, and the two of them have settled, without ever discussing it, into a comfortable arrangement where a badge shown and a cap touched is conversation enough for 7:28 in the morning. Drive north from the city center, past the Rose Bowl and the dry, wide riverbed of the Arroyo Seco, and the houses thin out. The road climbs into scrub oak and chaparral, sagebrush and dust, the foothills of the San Gabriels, rising steep and close, still green from a wet spring, but already going the tawny color they wear for most of the year. This is where you find it. A cluster of buildings, low and plain, some still wearing the temporary look of the army barracks. They were built to resemble 20 years earlier, tucked into a bend of the dry wash below Devil's Gate Dam. A chain link, a guard shack with a soldier in it, because in October of 1958, this laboratory still belongs, on paper, to the United States Army, run day to day by the California Institute of Technology a few miles south. Even as a brand new civilian agency in Washington, barely 2 weeks old, has begun the long paperwork of taking it over. Nobody here talks about the transfer much, yet there is too much else to do. They call it the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and it began more than 20 years before this quiet October morning as a handful of Caltech graduate students setting off homemade rocket motors in this same dry canyon and getting thrown off campus. By 1958, it is something else entirely, a working government laboratory with its own machine shops and wind tunnels and test stands built into the hillside where twice a week or so, usually in the early afternoon, a distant sound rolls down out of the canyon like slow thunder with no storm attached to it. A static test firing, some engine bolted to a stand, screaming for 30 or 60 seconds, while instruments record everything it does. People who have worked here long enough stop noticing it. New employees, the first few times, put down their pencils and look up. The economics of this place are worth pausing over, even briefly, before we go inside. A man working an assembly line job in Greater Los Angeles in 1958 might bring home somewhere in the neighborhood of $80 a week before taxes. A loaf of bread costs around 20 cents. A gallon of gasoline runs a quarter. A modest new tract house, the kind going up where the orange groves used to stand, sells for perhaps $12,000 or $13,000, which sounds small until you remember that the same $80 weekly paycheck has to stretch to cover it, along with the rest of a family's life. Money here is not abstract. It is measured out in a way that makes people careful, and it will matter quite a bit to the story of the woman we are about to meet. Because what she earns for the precision of her mind and the precision of her paycheck are not, as we will see later tonight, the same kind of precision at all. Walk through the gate this morning, past the guard, who nods at faces he has seen 5 days a week for years, and barely glances at faces he does not recognize, and you come first to the machine shops, already loud lathes turning. Past those, up a gravel path lined with a few struggling young trees, someone planted with more hope than shade, sits a plain wooden building with a corrugated roof and a row of windows that someone props open every morning, regardless of the temperature, because the building has no other way to breathe. A hand-lettered sign beside the door reads, in stenciled government type, computing section. Step inside, and the outside world falls away almost entirely. The room smells of 3 things at once. Fresh coffee, brewing in a percolator on a side table that someone refills every morning without being asked. Mimeograph, ink, sharp and faintly chemical, from a stack of instruction sheets run off the machine down the hall the evening before. And underneath both of those, a dry, papery graphite smell, the smell of pencil shavings and ruled paper in use, The smell that a room takes on when the same kind of careful, repetitive work has been done in it for years. The floor is polished linoleum, government tan, buffed to a dull shine by a janitor who takes real pride in it, and it holds the cold a little longer than the rest of the room in the early morning, so that more than one woman in this room keeps a pair of house slippers under her desk to change into once she is settled, only to swap back into her pumps the moment she needs to walk to the supply closet or the ladies' room. Because slippers are not, under any circumstance, the section chief has ever laid down part of the uniform. Rows of wooden desks fill the room, maybe 24 of them, arranged in facing pairs so that the women working at them can pass a ledger across without standing. On each desk, beside a cup holding sharpened pencils and a stack of pink and white eraser shavings that nobody has emptied yet, sits a mechanical calculating machine the size of a portable typewriter, its keys arranged in tidy columns. A wall clock, the kind with a red second hand that sweeps rather than ticks, hangs above the door. And everyone in the room, at some point in the next 8 hours, will glance up at it more times than they could count. This is where our story happens tonight, not at a launch pad. Not in a control room with banks of blinking lights. Here, in a converted barracks building that still smells faintly of the lumber it was built from, where a woman named Louise Whitfield is about to walk through the door with her lunch in a paper sack and the path of a rocket for the next 8 hours. Louise Whitfield is 29 years old. She has been at the laboratory for 5 years, since 1953, which, by the standards of the computing section, makes her something close to senior, though nobody here uses that word out loud, because the job itself carries no formal rank above the section chief. She keeps her dark hair set in short, careful waves that she manages herself on Sunday nights, because a trip to the beauty parlor every week is not in the household budget. And she wears, most days, a grey or navy skirt with a cardigan buttoned over a blouse, low-heeled pumps, and a pair of cat-eye glasses with clear lenses she needs only for close work. Which is to say, she needs them for most of her waking day. She's married to a man named Walter, a machinist at a small precision parts shop over in Alhambra, the kind of shop that makes fittings and housings for companies that make things for companies that make things for the aircraft industry, 3 steps removed from anything that ever gets a name in a newspaper. They have one daughter, Carol, 6 years old, in the 1st grade at the elementary school, 4 blocks from their small stucco bungalow. Most mornings it is Louise's mother, Ruth, who lives 2 streets over and never quite got used to being asked to babysit rather than simply visit, who walks Carol to school and collects her again in the afternoon. The household runs, as most households in this neighborhood run, on an arrangement nobody wrote down, but everyone honors. Walter leaves for the machine shop a little before 7. Louise leaves a little after, dropping Carol at her mother's door on the way, and the 2 women have worked out an unspoken accounting between them, meals traded for hours, favors banked and returned, that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the fact that a woman with a full-time position at a government laboratory in 1958 does not, generally speaking, have any other kind of help available to her. There is no such thing, in this world, as paid childcare that a family like the Whitfields could afford on top of everything else. There is only Ruth and the quiet gratitude Louise carries for her, mixed with the guilt she has never quite said out loud, the sense that she is asking her mother to spend her retirement raising a 2nd child. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you sit with it. Louise did not fall into this work. She sought it out and paid for the seeking in ways that are easy to overlook from a distance of decades. She studied mathematics at Pasadena City College, one of a small handful of women in classes where professors sometimes seemed faintly puzzled by her presence, not hostile, just puzzled, as though she had wandered into the wrong building and would eventually notice. She applied to the laboratory the same month she finished her coursework, in 1953, after a professor mentioned, almost as an aside, that JPL sometimes hired women who were quick with figures. She was quick with figures. It is, in fact, the single thing about her that everyone in this building agrees on without argument, from the section chief down to the newest hire. The section chief is a woman named Mrs. Constance Marsh, in her early 50s, who has run the computing section since the war and runs it now the way a good conductor runs an orchestra, which is to say, firmly, without raising her voice more than she has to. Marsh assigns the work, checks the work, and enforces, without a shred of apparent doubt about its importance, the dress code that governs every woman who walks through that door. Skirts, never slacks. Stockings, always regardless of the Southern California heat. Blouses buttoned to a modest height at the collar. Cardigans permitted and quietly encouraged, since the building's heating is unreliable at best. Lipstick permitted, but nothing Mrs. Marsh would describe as loud. The logic behind the code is never explained and rarely questioned, though it is worth noting, quietly, that no such code exists for the men in the engineering building 100 yards away who wear whatever they like under their lab coats and have never once been asked whether their trousers are appropriate for their work. Mrs. Marsh herself came up through exactly the same kind of computing pool during the war, though she rarely mentions the specifics, and the exacting standard she holds the room to now were, by her own account on the one occasion Louise heard her discuss it, standards she once resented as a younger woman and has since come to see differently. She believes, plainly and without much room for debate, that a woman's work in this field is judged the moment she is judged, as a woman at all, unfairly and constantly, and that the only defense available to leave absolutely nothing else for a critic to seize on. A wrinkled blouse, a late arrival, a moment of visible frustration, any of it, in her view, becomes ammunition not just against the woman who provided it, but against every other woman in the room who will be measured unfairly by the same brush afterward. It is a hard philosophy, and not every woman who has passed through the computing section over the years has agreed with it. But it is a philosophy built out of real experience rather than vanity. And even the women who chafe against it tend to admit, eventually, that Mrs. Marsh has never once asked of anyone else a standard she does not hold herself to. First, arriving earliest, leaving latest. Her own ledger work as flawless after 15 years. Marsh, that almost nobody at the laboratory has seen, though Louise caught a glimpse of it once, 2 years ago, when Mrs. Marsh's mother died back in Ohio, and she returned from the funeral a week later, looking, for the first time anyone could remember, truly tired rather than merely composed. She said nothing about it beyond a brief factual mention of the trip, and the section, following her own lead, asked nothing further, though more than one woman found small, quiet ways that week to take a task off her desk before she had to ask. It was never discussed afterward. It simply happened, the way real kindness in that room usually happens, without ceremony, and without anyone needing to be thanked for it out loud. A private detail, since we are getting to know her. Louise reads detective novels, one a week, without fail, borrowed from the Pasadena Public Library on her lunch hour, and she has strong, unshakable opinions about which authors cheat their readers by hiding clues, rather than simply making the reader miss them. She thinks most mystery writers are, in her word, lazy. She has never told anyone at the laboratory this opinion, because it seems to her like the kind of thing that would sound strange coming from a woman whose actual job is finding hidden patterns in numbers for 8 hours a day. She has never quite noticed the irony herself, though we can notice it for her. Her day-to-day is, by the section's own definition, entirely ordinary, which is exactly why we have chosen it. There is no launch scheduled for this Tuesday. There is, instead, the steady, unglamorous work that makes launches possible at all. Work that has been sitting on Louise's desk in the form of a green-bound ledger for 3 days running. A rocket is being readied up. The hill and a few buildings over that laboratory staff refer to among themselves simply as the probe. A small science payload that engineers hope, if all goes well over the following days, will do something no American object has yet managed, which is to leave the Earth's gravity behind entirely and pass near the Moon. Before it can attempt that, its trajectory has to be worked out and reworked and checked twice over by 2 separate computers working independently, so that any human error gets caught before it becomes a very expensive and very public failure 400 miles up. Louise's assignment book, a plain black notebook she keeps in her top desk drawer, has today's task written in her own small, tidy hand from Friday afternoon before she left for the weekend. Complete second differencing pass, sheet 14 through sheet 22, cross-check against Aft Doyle's independent run. Flag any deviation over .001. She does not know yet, as she pushes open the door of the computing section at 7:28 in the morning, exactly how the day will go. She rarely does. That, too, is part of the job. The morning began 3 hours earlier, in the dark, the way it begins most weekdays. Louise is up at 4:45 before Walter's alarm and well before Carol stirs, because the bathroom in a house with 1 bathroom and 3 people who all need it belongs, by long negotiation, to Louise first. She dresses by the grey early light rather than switching on the overhead bulb, out of a habit formed years ago of not wanting to wake anyone, choosing from a small, careful rotation of skirts and blouses that all answer, without her needing to think about it anymore. The unwritten question the laboratory asks of every woman who walks through its gate each morning: is this modest enough? Is this serious enough? Will this draw exactly the amount of attention a competent professional woman is permitted to draw, which is to say, none at all? She rolls her stockings on sitting at the edge of the bed, checks the seam in the dim mirror on the closet door, and pins her hair with 3 bobby pins she keeps in a chipped saucer on the dresser that used to belong to her own mother. Breakfast is toast and coffee standing at the counter, because sitting down to eat is a luxury reserved for the household's youngest member. Carol gets scrambled eggs and a glass of milk at the kitchen table, while Louise packs 2 lunches, hers and Carol's for after school at Ruth's, into brown paper sacks that get reused until the crease finally gives out. Walter is already gone by the time Louise walks Carol the 2 blocks to her mother's small frame house, where Ruth is standing on the porch in a housecoat with her own coffee, ready to take her granddaughter's hand and walk her the remaining 4 blocks to school once the girl has finished the toast Ruth insists on feeding her anyway, regardless of what Louise already fed her at home. Louise kisses her daughter's head, says the same thing she says most mornings: "Be good for Grandma," and walks the last stretch to the bus stop on Colorado Street with a mathematics problem already forming somewhere in the back of her mind, because the differencing pass she left unfinished on Friday has been sitting there quietly the whole weekend. The way an unfinished sentence sits in a person's mouth. The bus climbs out of the flat grid of the city and into the foothills, and by the time Louise steps off at the laboratory gate, the light has gone from grey to that pale autumn gold we mentioned earlier, catching the dust the bus kicks up and turning it, briefly the colour of a held breath. She shows her badge to the same guard who has waved her through 5 days a week for years, walks past the machine shops, already loud with the day's first cutting, and reaches the computing section 2 minutes ahead of the hour she has set for herself. which is not the hour the laboratory requires, but the hour Louise requires of herself. Because arriving exactly on time, to her, feels indistinguishable from arriving late. Inside, the room is filling. Barbara Kessler, 22 years old and barely 2 years out of Pasadena City College herself, is already at her desk 2 rows over, sharpening a pencil with the small hand-cranked sharpener bolted to the windowsill. Her cat-eye glasses pushed up into hair still damp from a shower she clearly took in a hurry. Barbara arrived at the laboratory the previous winter, and within a few months found herself assigned to the trajectory team working the numbers for the small satellite that went up in January. The one that gave the whole country something to feel proud of after a difficult autumn. She does not talk about it much. When she does, she tends to undersell it, the way people who did something remarkable while very young sometimes learn to undersell it, because overselling it seems to invite a kind of scrutiny nobody much wants. Perhaps she thinks of those January weeks now as the proudest stretch of her short career, and simply keeps that pride private, tucked somewhere. She does not examine too closely on an ordinary Tuesday. Perhaps she thinks of them, instead, as the moment she stopped being nervous about the work, the numbers having proven to her once and for all that her hand could be trusted. Or perhaps, more likely than either, she thinks of them hardly at all this morning because there is a new set of sheets in front of her, and the old work, however proud it made her, does not check itself. Louise remembers her own first morning in this room the way most people remember a test they were terrified of failing, which is more or less what it was. Before the laboratory hired her in 1953, it asked her to sit for a full afternoon in a bare office near the front gate and complete a timed arithmetic examination, long columns of multiplication and division, the kind of test designed specifically to separate women who were merely good at figures from women who were fast and accurate under pressure. Because the laboratory had learned by then that the second quality mattered far more than the first. She remembers the pencil they gave her, a stub already worn down by whoever sat that same desk the week before, and the sound of a wall clock ticking through 3 hours, while a supervisor she never saw again walked slow laps around the room. She passed with a score high enough that the man who reviewed it, a mathematician named Whitcomb who left the laboratory years ago for a university post back east, told her afterward, with what she took at the time for genuine surprise, that he rarely saw a sheet that clean. She has thought about that comment more than once in the 5 years since, turning it over the way you turn over a coin to see both sides. It was meant, she is fairly sure, as a compliment. It also told her something about what he had expected to see instead. Her first weeks on the job were spent almost entirely under close supervision. Every sheet, double and triple, checked by a senior computer before it went anywhere near an engineer's desk. A probation that felt at the time like a personal test of her worth, rather than the standard procedure it actually was for every new hire, regardless of sex. She remembers being terrified of the Marchant itself in those first days, a machine that seemed, in her memory now half embarrassed and half fond, to have a mind of its own, prone to jamming at exactly the moment a result was due. She remembers Mrs. Marsh, then, as now not given to unnecessary warmth, telling her, after her second week, that her figures were sound, and that she should stop apologizing every time she asked a question. Louise took that instruction seriously, in the specific way she takes most instructions seriously, and has not, so far as she can recall, apologized for asking a question since. 5 years on, she is the one now watching Barbara settle into this same room, and she recognizes, in the younger woman's occasional hesitation before speaking up, an echo of her own first months. At the desk across from Barbara sits Frances Doyle, 44, who came to this kind of work by a very different road. During the war, Francis sat in a government office in Maryland, computing ballistics tables for artillery shells, one line of arithmetic after another, for hours that blurred into each other. Work she has never once described as glamorous. She lost her husband in that same war, a fact she has mentioned to Louise exactly once in 5 years of sitting near each other, in a tone that made clear the subject was closed the moment she opened it. Francis is the one Louise's sheets get checked against today, the independent second computer whose column of results has to match Louise's own, digit for digit, before the trajectory can move forward to the engineers upstairs. It is in a quiet way the whole architecture of trust in this room. Not one person's word, two people's arithmetic, done apart, made to agree. Mrs. Barr. Marsh moves through the room the way she does every morning, pausing at each desk just long enough to see what page a woman is on, saying little, expecting little, in the way of conversation before 9. Because conversation before 9, in her long experience, is where careless numbers get born. She reaches Louise's desk, glances at the green ledger already open to sheet 14, and says only, "Keep at it," before moving on. It is not warmth, exactly. It is something more useful than warmth at 7:30 in the morning. It is the confidence of someone who has never once had reason to doubt Louise Whitfield's arithmetic, and says so by saying almost nothing at all. By 8 o'clock, the room has found its rhythm, the sound now filling every corner of it. A rhythm that anyone who worked here for more than a week or two would stop hearing consciously and simply feel the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. 20 mechanical calculators being worked at once produce a sound unlike almost anything else in American life in 1958. A layered clatter of gears and levers, some machines cranked by hand, some newer ones driven by a small electric motor that adds a low, continuous hum underneath the clacking, so that the whole room together sounds faintly like rain on a tin roof. If rain could also occasionally ring a small bell when a calculation carried past 9 digits, under that sound sits another, quieter one, the whisper of pencils moving across ruled paper, the soft slide of a slide rule's cursor, the occasional flip of a page in a table of logarithms kept, dog-eared and reverent, in every desk drawer in the room. Let us pause here and correct something, because this is exactly the kind of detail people miss when they picture the space program in 1958. The image most people carry, if they carry one at all, is of a single genius scientist scribbling an equation on a chalkboard and having the answer arrive in a flash of insight. The reality in this room is almost the opposite of genius in the popular sense of that word. It is patience. It is repetition. A trajectory calculation is not one clever idea. It is thousands of small, identical, unglamorous steps, each one checked, each one capable of ruining everything if it is wrong, performed by women who were hired, in plain language, because they were fast and because they did not make mistakes, and who then spent 8 hours a day proving that assessment correct, one line at a time. Louise works methodically down sheet 14, entering values into the marchand, pulling the lever, reading the result, transcribing it into the ledger in her small, careful hand, before moving to the next line. The rocket does not care that this is tedious. Neither does gravity. Somewhere behind her patience is a kind of respect for both of those facts that she would probably never put into exactly these words, but which shows in the way she never once, in 5 years, has let a page go to Mrs. Marsh's desk with a figure she was not sure of. It is worth understanding, for a moment, what this second differencing pass actually asks of her, because the phrase itself sounds cold and mechanical, and the work underneath it is neither. A rocket's path through space is not a straight line and not a simple curve either. It bends constantly, pulled this way by the Earth's gravity, that way by its own remaining thrust, nudged by forces so small that no single equation captures all of them cleanly at once. So the method Louise uses instead treats the path as a great many tiny, nearly straight steps stitched together, each one calculated from the step before it, correcting slightly for how the curve bent last time. It is patient work, by design, arithmetic built specifically to be done by a careful hand rather than guessed at by a clever one, because guessing is exactly what this kind of navigation cannot afford. Every entry on sheet 14 depends on the entry above it, so a single wrong figure near the top does not stay contained. It rides forward through every calculation beneath it, quietly bending the whole predicted path further and further from the truth. The further down the page you travel, the way a single wrong note early in a long piece of music can throw off everything played after it, even if every note that follows is on its own played correctly. This is why the checking matters as much as the calculating, and why Francis's independent column exists at all. It is also, in its own way, a kind of choreography, though nobody in the room would use so grand a word for it out loud. Left hand entering figures into the Martian. Right hand recording the result. Eyes moving from the machine's dial to the ledger and back, dozens of times an hour, hour after hour, the whole sequence repeating with a rhythm that becomes, after enough years, almost physical rather than mental, the body doing half the remembering that the mind used to have to hold on to consciously. Louise no longer thinks in any deliberate way about which key to press first or how to carry a remainder from one column to the next. Her hands simply know the way a pianist's hands know a scale, freeing the rest of her attention for the one thing that still requires it fully, which is catching the moment when a number feels even slightly wrong before it has the chance to travel any further down the page. It is 10:15 before anyone in the room takes a real break, and even then it is brief. A cup of coffee refilled at the percolator, a few words exchanged standing up rather than sitting down, because sitting down invites the kind of conversation that makes the next hour harder to start again. Barbara mentions quietly that the teletype down the hall has been busier than usual since dawn, tracking data coming in from a station out near the desert, numbers about where a certain object currently sits in the sky, numbers that will eventually need computers exactly like this room full of them to turn into something useful. Nobody in the computing section has been told, in so many words, that the coming week's launch is close. They have simply noticed, why anyone notices weather changing, before the forecast confirms it, that the pace of incoming data has quickened, and the room, without any announcement, has quickened faintly along with it. That rhythm and the paycheck that keeps it running week after week opens a door into something larger than one Tuesday morning. Let us walk through it for a while before we go back to sheet 14. Louise Whitfield earns, in the fall of 1958, a salary in the neighborhood of $3,400 a year. It is not a bad wage for a woman in this decade. It is, by the standards of women's employment in 1958, a genuinely good one, better than most clerical work and far better than retail or domestic service. Set it beside the men working in the engineering building 100 yards up the gravel path, though men with the same mathematics degrees, sometimes with less coursework in the specific techniques Louise uses every day. And the number tells a different story. Those men are classified, on paper, as engineers or engineering aides. The women in the computing section are classified as sub-professional. The distinction has almost nothing to do with the difficulty of the work, and almost everything to do with who is doing it. A junior male engineer at the laboratory with a fresh degree and considerably less practical hand calculation skill than Louise might start at something closer to $5,000 a year and climb from there in ways the sub-professional pay scale simply does not allow, no matter how many years a woman like Louise puts in. No matter how flawless her sheet 14 comes back, the household economics beneath that number are worth sitting with too. Walter brings home something like $4,000 a year from the machine shop in Alhambra, so the Whitfield household runs, combined, on somewhere around $7,400 annually. Comfortable by the measure of their street, enough for the small bungalow. Why? A week at a rented cabin near Big Bear most summers. It is not a struggling household. But it is also not a household with much slack in it, and Louise does the family's bookkeeping on Sunday evenings at the kitchen table with the same careful hand she uses on sheet 1-4, because the arithmetic of groceries and the mortgage payment and Carol's shoes, which she seems to outgrow every few months, matters just as much to Louise as the arithmetic of a rocket's path, even if only one of the two ever gets discussed at the laboratory. There is a smaller, quieter economics tucked inside all of this, one that rarely makes it into any official account of the space program, and it concerns the simple cost of looking the part every single day. A woman working at the laboratory in 1958 is expected to maintain a standard of dress that a man in the same building is never asked to think about twice. Dye-9 stockings run, snag, and ladder with ordinary wear, and a pair costs somewhere around $1 to $1.50, a real sum against a weekly paycheck, and most women in that room go through several pairs a month, mending small runs with a dab of clear nail polish to buy one more day out of a pair that has already given all it has to give. A tailored blouse, a good cardigan, a pair of low pumps, sturdy enough for a 5-day work week, all of it has to be bought and replaced out of a salary already set, lower than a man's, for reasons having nothing to do with the work itself. Call it, if you like, the invisible tax on being taken seriously while female. Nobody at the laboratory would have used that phrase in 1958, but the ledger, if anyone had cared to keep one, would have shown the cost plainly enough. Put Louise's household budget beside a young engineer's household budget for a moment, and the comparison sharpens further. A junior engineer starting at the laboratory this same year, unmarried, renting a single room rather than supporting a wife and daughter, might easily set aside more of his paycheck in savings each month than Louise's entire household spends on clothing, transportation, and incidentals combined. He is not required to wear anything more specific than a clean shirt and a reasonably pressed pair of trousers, an outfit that cost him almost nothing to maintain, compared with the wardrobe upkeep expected of every woman in the computing section. He eats lunch at a diner some days without much thought to the expense, where Louise packs a sandwich from home in wax paper, reused past the point most households would consider reasonable, because a dime saved on lunch is a dime that still needs to stretch toward Carol's shoes and the mortgage and the week's groceries. None of this made either man or woman a villain in the story. It simply meant that identical talent, sitting on either side of the same gravel path, carried very different financial weather, depending on which building it happened to sit in. The mortgage itself is worth a moment's attention too, since it anchors everything else in the Whitfield household's arithmetic. Walter and Louise bought their small bungalow in 1955 for a little under $11,000, financed through a 30-year note that runs them somewhere near $70 a month, a manageable sum against their combined income, but one that leaves little room for the unexpected, a car repair, a doctor's visit, a roof that starts to leak. They keep it between them, a small savings account at a bank on Colorado Street that Louise adds to whenever the month allows it, and draws from as rarely as she can manage, a habit her own mother instilled in her during years that were considerably leaner than these, and one that shapes more than either of them probably realizes. The quiet caution with which Louise approaches every part of her life, including the numbers on sheet 14. And there is one more figure worth placing beside all the others, because it says something about how the laboratory itself valued precision without necessarily valuing the people who supplied it. A single slide rule, the good kind, the kind an engineer or a senior computer might carry in a leather case clipped to a desk drawer, cost somewhere around $15 to $20 in 1958. Several days of Louise's own wages for a tool she was nonetheless expected, in many cases, to supply or maintain herself. While the Marchant and Frieden calculators lining the desks, machines costing many times that sum, belonged to the laboratory and were treated, understandably, as institutional property to be protected and accounted for at the end of every week. The line between what the institution valued enough to own outright and what it left to the individual to scrape together tells you almost everything you need to know about where, in this hierarchy, the women of the computing section actually stood. For Louise, none of this arithmetic is abstract. It is Sunday evenings at the kitchen table. It is a run in her last good pair of stockings on a Tuesday morning, mended with polish rather than replaced, because replaced means a trip to the drugstore that the week's budget has not accounted for. It is a quiet, ongoing calculation she performs alongside the one she is paid for, matching a family's needs against a paycheck that everyone in the building, if pressed, would admit is smaller than it should be for work this precise. She has never once asked for a raise. In 1958, in this building, on this pay scale, the thought barely occurs to her as a real option, and that, more than any single dollar figure, is the detail worth sitting with the longest. Let us return now to sheet 14 and to the rest of Louise Whitfield's Tuesday. By late morning, the computing section has settled into the deep, unhurried focus that Mrs. Marsh prizes above almost everything else, and it is into that quiet that a man named Perrin walks a little before 11, a project engineer from the building up the gravel path. His lab coat still buttoned, though he has clearly come outside in it more than once already this morning. He does not remove his hat. He rarely does when he steps into the computing section, a small habit that Louise noticed years ago and has never mentioned to anyone, because it seems petty to mention, and yet she has never quite managed to stop noticing it. Perrin wants to know how far along the second differencing pass has gotten, whether sheet 14 through sheet 22 will be ready by end of day, because the trajectory numbers are needed upstairs before the engineers can finalize a guidance parameter. Mrs. Marsh answers him herself, telling him the section will have it, and Perrin nods, glances once around the room the way a man glances at a factory floor he does not fully understand but trusts to keep running, and leaves. Nobody in the room seems to mind. Not openly. It has happened before, and it will happen again, and everyone here understands without resentment exactly that credit for the number, when it finally reaches a memo or a newspaper months from now, will attach itself to Perrin's name or to some engineer above his, and not to the woman whose pencil actually produced it. Perrin is not the only visitor the building sees this morning. A little after him, word travels down from the front office that a man from Washington, someone attached to the new civilian agency, still finding its feet after barely 10 days of official existence, is touring the laboratory today, part of a small delegation trying to understand exactly what it has just inherited from the army. Barbara catches sight of him through the window a little before noon, a trim man in a grey suit far too formal for the Southern California climate, flanked by two of the laboratory's senior engineers, all three of them walking the gravel path toward the test stands rather than toward the computing section. This does not surprise anyone in the room, enough to comment on it out loud. Important visitors are shown the machine shops, the wind tunnels, the test stands where the static firings shake the canyon twice a week. They are shown the parts of the laboratory that look, to an untrained eye, passing through quickly, like where the real work happens. Nobody from Washington has ever asked to see the room where the trajectory itself gets worked out. And nobody in the computing section expects that to change today. Mrs. Marsh, glancing up once at the little procession passing the window, says only that she hopes the man enjoys the tour, in a tone dry enough that Barbara has to look down at her ledger to keep from smiling. There is a kind of humor that survives in a room like this, precisely because it has to, a small release valve for a job that otherwise offers very little room for levity. Dot, still humming under her breath at the far end of the room, mutters that she would gladly show the man from Washington her own ledger if anyone asked, and would be glad to explain exactly which of his rocket's numbers came from a woman in a cardigan rather than from a wind tunnel. Nobody The joke lands, anyway, rippling quietly down the row of desks. A ripple of amusement passed almost entirely without words. A raised eyebrow here, a suppressed laugh there, the kind of solidarity that gets built slowly out of 100 small moments like this one rather than out of any single dramatic stand taken by anyone. Louise allows herself a small smile over her own ledger and returns to sheet 17. The man in the grey suit will be gone within the hour, back to Washington within a week, having seen, by his own account afterward, an impressive and well-run rocket laboratory. He will not think to mention the room he never entered, because he will never know to ask about it, and that, more than almost anything else this Tuesday, tells you exactly how thoroughly this kind of invisibility gets built into a place, one unremarkable, well-intentioned oversight at a time. Lunch, when it comes at 12:30, is taken in shifts, because someone has to stay at a desk in case the teletype down the hall needs an answer sent back quickly. Louise eats her sandwich egg salad today, wrapped in wax paper, gone slightly translucent with use, sitting at her own desk with the green ledger closed for exactly the 22 minutes she allows herself, reading 3 chapters of a library mystery propped against her thermos. She has worked out by now that the detective in this novel is going to turn out to be the least likely suspect's brother, and she is fairly certain the author has hidden the clue rather than played fair with it, a small private complaint she plans to have no one to share with until she sees her sister on Sunday, who reads the same books and holds the same standards. Barbara and Francis eat together on the low wall just outside the building, in the thin autumn sun, a habit the two of them have kept up since spring regardless of the season, trading sections of the newspaper, and, more quietly, trading worry. Francis has heard, through a friend who works in the front office, that the coming launch attempt carries higher stakes than the ones that came before it, not because the engineering is worse, but because a second American failure so soon after the first satellite success. Barbara listens without saying much, turning a blade of dry grass between her fingers, thinking, perhaps, of the numbers she is currently responsible for and what it would mean if one of them were wrong. Neither woman puts this worry into any dramatic language. They are not the sort of women who do that. It simply sits between them on the low wall. The way it sits, in one form or another, at every desk inside. Barbara has asked Francis once or twice over the months what the war work was actually like back in Maryland, and Francis answers these questions carefully in small measured portions, the way a person answers who has learned that the whole story is too heavy to hand over all at once. She tells Barbara about the long tables of women bent over adding machines identical in spirit to the ones 2 rows over from where they sit now, computing where an artillery shell would land given 100 different combinations of wind elevation, and powder charge. Work that had to be finished in hours, because soldiers somewhere were waiting on the tables to know where to aim. She does not tell Barbara, because she has never told anyone at the laboratory, that her husband was killed by exactly the kind of ordnance whose flight she once helped chart on a different front, a battle whose name she still avoids saying out loud when she can help it. The two facts sit beside each other in her memory the way they always have, without resolving into any tidy lesson. A woman who spent the war calculating how shells fly and lost a husband to shells calculated by someone else entirely, on the other side, doing work that likely looked, from the outside, almost identical to her own. Frances came to the laboratory in 1951, 2 years before Louise, drawn west partly by the climate and partly by a simple practical fact, which is that a widow with no children needs an income, and this was the kind of income a woman with her exact training could actually earn. She has never remarried, has never seemed, so far as anyone in the computing section can tell, especially inclined to, and has built instead a quiet, orderly life around this room. Her small rented house near the Rose Bowl, and a standing Sunday afternoon spent at the Huntington Gardens, walking the same paths at the same unhurried pace most weeks, a habit she describes, when asked, as the only hour of her week when her mind is allowed to do absolutely nothing at all. Barbara, 22, and still assembling her own sense of what a life might look like 20 years further along, watches Frances sometimes with a curiosity she has not yet learned to name, wondering in the unspoken way the young wonder about the old, whether this quiet, capable, solitary competence is a fate to want or a fate to avoid. So far, at no settled answer, either way. The early afternoon brings the day's one real interruption, and it is a small one, though it does not feel small at the time. At 1:45, Marsh calls Louise and Frances, both to her desk at the front of the room, holding 2 sheets side by side, one from each woman's ledger, a single figure on line 11 that disagrees by 3 thousandths, a difference so small it would mean nothing in most kinds of arithmetic, and could mean quite a lot in this one. This is the entire reason the section runs 2 independent computers on every important pass rather than one. The 2 women stand at Mrs. Marsh's desk and work the line again together, out loud, each checking her own steps against the others, until Frances finds it, a transposed digit, 3 lines earlier in her own column, that had quietly carried itself forward through everything after it. She corrects it without any visible embarrassment, the way a good carpenter corrects a measurement without treating it as a wound to her pride. And the 2 sheets agree again within a few minutes. Mrs. Pre. Marsh says only, "Good," and returns to her own desk. Nobody apologizes at length. Nobody makes a production of it. This is simply what precision looks like when it is being manufactured by hand, hour after hour. And it looks, more often than people imagine, like quiet correction rather than flawless perfection. Now, here is where most people get the space program wrong, and this moment is as good as any to say it plainly. The image of 1958 rocketry that has survived into the present day is one of dramatic breakthroughs, sudden flashes of genius, men in white shirts shouting numbers across a control room. The reality this room shows us, hour after hour, is closer to the opposite. Precision here is not achieved. It is maintained continuously against the ordinary human tendency to make small errors through redundancy and cross-checking, and a willingness to find your own mistake without flinching from it. Frances Doyle's correction at 1:45 will never appear in any official account of this launch. It will simply be absorbed into a trajectory that works, invisible, the moment it stops being wrong. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, Louise and Barbara find themselves at the ladies' room sink at the same moment, a small errand that has, over the years, quietly become one of the few places in the building where a woman can say something a little more candid than the room outside allows. Barbara mentions rinsing graphite from the side of her hand that Perrin's hat habit has started to truly irritate her, and Louise laughs before she can stop herself, admitting she noticed it herself years ago and has simply filed it away rather than let it bother her. Barbara asks, half joking, whether it ever stops mattering, all of it, the hat and the dress code, and the quiet understanding that credit will land somewhere else. Louise considers the question seriously before answering, because Barbara is asking it seriously, and says that it stops mattering less than you would think and more than you would like, in roughly equal measure, and that the trick, if there is one, is deciding for yourself, since it was never going to be the newspaper photograph. Barbara turns this over for a moment, drying her hands on the roller towel, and says only that she supposes that is fair, in a tone that suggests she will keep turning it over well after this afternoon has ended. The two of them walk back to their desks a minute apart, so as not to draw Mrs. Bree, Marsh's notice for lingering, and the small exchange folds itself back into the ordinary rhythm of the room, as though it never happened, though it plainly has, in the quiet way that most of what matters in this building happens. By 3 o'clock the room has warmed considerably, the afternoon sun now coming almost level through the propped open windows, and someone, it is usually Barbara, gets up to adjust the blinds against the glare on her ledger paper. The percolator gets refilled a second time. A woman named Dot, at the far end of the room, hums under her breath while she works, a habit Mrs. Me. Marsh has long since stopped correcting because Dot's page is always flawless, and a section chief learns, eventually, which small comforts are worth the peace they buy. Louise finishes sheet 19 a little after 3:30 and allows herself a moment, just a moment, to look out the window at the dry hills going gold in the slanting light before turning the page. There is a quiet pleasure she has found over 5 years, in the last hour before the workday's real momentum shifts toward the close, when the numbers seem to come slightly easier, as though her hand has simply warmed into the rhythm of the day the way a car engine warms into its idle. That small correction at Mrs. Marsh's desk, the transposed digit, found and fixed without a single raised voice, opens a door into something larger than one Tuesday afternoon. There is more to understand here about how a woman came to be sitting at that desk at all, and about what this work cost her in ways that never showed up on any ledger page. The word computer, as it is used inside this building, is not a new word in 1958, and it did not begin its life attached to a machine. For more than a century before this morning, a computer was simply a person, usually a woman, hired specifically because she could perform arithmetic quickly and reliably. Astronomers in the previous century hired rooms full of women to reduce star observations into usable catalogues. During the war that ended 13 years before this Tuesday, the need for that same skill exploded overnight, as artillery tables, bombing tables, and early rocket calculations all required thousands of hours of hand computation. Women were recruited by the thousands, Frances Doyle among them, and for a few years the work was treated, out of sheer necessity, as serious and essential. Then the war ended, the men came home, and most of those computing pools were quietly dismantled, their women sent back to whatever life had been interrupted in 1941, the assumption being that the arrangement had always been temporary, a wartime measure rather than a discovery about who was capable of the work. The laboratory in the hills above Pasadena is one of a small number of places where that assumption did not fully hold, mostly because rocketry itself was too new and too specialized for anyone to have built an alternative pipeline of trained men to replace the women who already knew how to do it. So the computing section survived the peace and even grew, staffed by women who had proven, first under wartime pressure and later under the pressure of an entirely new and uncertain field, that their arithmetic could be trusted with consequences measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. That survival was never framed inside the laboratory as a victory for women in science. It was framed, when it was framed at all, as simple efficiency. The section worked. Nobody wanted to break something that worked. The education that brought Louise and her colleagues into this room followed a narrow, well-worn path. A woman with an aptitude for mathematics in this era was steered, gently but firmly, almost always toward teaching. Teaching was considered a suitable use of a woman's talent, respectable, compatible with an eventual marriage and family, easily set aside if a husband's career required a move. Engineering programs at most universities admitted women rarely and made little secret of their skepticism when they did. A handful of women in Louise's own mathematics classes at Pasadena City College went on to teach high school algebra. Louise, and a few others like her, found their way instead into laboratories and aerospace contractors that had discovered, almost by accident, that a mathematics degree without an engineering credential attached to it was still worth quite a lot, provided the woman holding it was willing to be classified as something less than an engineer, regardless of what she actually did all day. Teaching itself carried its own quiet trapdoor that many of Louise's classmates walked directly into without much choice in the matter. A great many school districts across the country in this era still enforced what people simply called the marriage bar, a policy, sometimes written into contracts and sometimes only understood, that a woman teacher would resign her position the moment she married, since a married woman was assumed to belong, from that point forward, to her household rather than to her classroom. The practice had loosened somewhat by the late 1952 compared to its strictest years during the Depression, but it lingered in enough districts that a young woman choosing teaching still had to weigh her career against her wedding plans in a way no young man training to be an engineer ever had to consider. The laboratory, whatever its other failings toward the women who work there, never enforced anything of the kind. Louise married Walter in 1952, a year before she was hired, and nobody at the laboratory so much as blinked at a wedding ring across the interview desk. It was, in its narrow way, one of the few doors this field left open that so many others had quietly nailed shut, not out of any special enlightenment on the laboratory's part, but simply because the shortage of women who could do this exact kind of arithmetic mattered more in practice than anyone's opinion about where a married woman belonged. Health and safety inside the computing section were treated by the standards that would arrive decades later, with a certain casual indifference that nobody at the time thought to question. The fluorescent lighting, the constant close work, the hours bent over ruled paper. None of it was measured or studied the way an employer today might measure eye strain or repetitive posture injuries among office workers. A woman who found her eyes aching or her back stiffening was simply expected to manage it, the same way she was expected to manage a run in her stockings or a headache from the coffee she drank to stay alert through the long afternoon stretch. There was no formal recourse for any of it, no official channel through which a woman could raise a concern about the conditions of her own body without the conversation sliding almost immediately into a quiet question about whether she was truly suited to work this demanding in the first place. Most women in the room, Louise included, simply decided the question was not worth raising and carried the eggs home with them instead, unspoken the way they carried so much else. There is a health cost to this work too, one rarely discussed at the time because discussing it would have meant admitting the conditions asked something of the body as well as the mind. Fluorescent tubes overhead flicker at a frequency most people in the room have stopped consciously noticing. But eye strain is a constant, quiet companion to an 8-hour day spent reading pencil figures off ruled paper under exactly that light. And more than one woman in the computing section wears reading glasses now who did not need them 5 years ago. The right hand of nearly everyone in this room carries a small, permanent callus where a pencil rests for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and the side of that same hand often bears a faint grey smudge by mid-morning, graphite worked into the skin from resting against freshly written figures, a smudge that no amount of washing at lunchtime fully removes. Backs ache from the particular posture that desks demand, shoulders rounded forward toward the ledger and the calculator both, and Mrs. Tiplar. Marsh has more than once suggested, quietly, that a woman stand and stretch for a moment between sheets, advice nearly everyone accepts and nearly everyone forgets to follow once the numbers pull her back in. The social codes governing this room are as exacting in their own way as the mathematics. Women eat lunch separately from the engineers, not by any written rule, but by an unspoken sorting that nobody has ever bothered to challenge. Women are rarely invited into the design review meetings where their own numbers get discussed, a fact that means Louise has, on more than one occasion, learned what became of a trajectory she calculated only second-hand through Mrs. Marsh, weeks after the fact. And when a newspaper reporter does occasionally visit the laboratory ahead of a launch, as one did the previous spring, he has walked through the engineering building and the test stands, photographed beside young men in shirt sleeves pointing at blueprints, and never once brought through the door marked computing section, though the computing section, I mean the plainest possible sense where the launch's actual path through space was worked out by hand. What all of this cost the women who lived inside it, day after day, was rarely spoken of directly. It showed instead in small, sideways admissions. Frances mentioning once that her eyes ache by 4 o'clock most days. Barbara underselling the proudest achievement of her short career, because pride seemed to invite questions she would rather not answer. Louise's quiet, permanent understanding that the raise she has earned many times over is simply not an avenue open to her, not through any failing of her own, but through the shape of the classification system itself. And yet, alongside all of that sat something else too, something genuine, which is the plain satisfaction of doing difficult work well. Every woman in that room knew, with a certainty nothing outside the room could give or take away, that her column of figures was correct. In a decade that offered women very few rooms where competence alone was the whole of the judgment, the computing section, whatever else it withheld, gave them that one thing without reservation. Let us return to the room now, because the afternoon is not quite finished with Louise Whitfield, and neither are we. By 4 o'clock, the light through the prop windows has gone from gold to something closer to amber, the shadows of the scrub oak outside stretching long across the gravel path, and the teletype down the hall has picked up a pace that even Mrs. Pompley, Marsh notices, glancing toward the sound more than once without saying anything about it. A boy from the message room, no more than 18, brings a fresh sheaf of tracking figures directly to Mrs. Cater. Marsh's desk, rather than leaving it in the usual tray, and something about the way he does it, quickly, almost apologetically, tells the room without a single word being spoken that the coming week's launch attempt has just moved a little closer. Nobody stops working. Nobody looks up for more than a second or two. But the pencils move slightly faster after that, and Louise notices her own hand keeping pace with a tension she has not consciously decided to feel. Barbara finishes her own section of the afternoon's work a little before 4:30 and sits for a moment with her pencil down, looking at the closed cover of her ledger the way a person looks at a door they are not quite ready to walk through. It is a small, private moment, the kind that would mean nothing to anyone watching from outside the room, and it is worth pausing on precisely because it is small. Perhaps, in this quiet minute, Barbara allows herself to think back to January, to the cold, tense week, when the whole country waited to hear whether the first American satellite had actually made it to orbit, and to the fact that her own careful arithmetic had been part of getting it there. Perhaps she remembers the newspapers the following morning, front pages full of photographs of men in overcoats standing at podiums, and no photograph anywhere of the room where the trajectory had actually been worked out. Or perhaps, more simply than either of those, she is only tired, her eyes aching in the particular way they ache by this hour, and the pencil in her hand has simply gone still for a moment because her hand needed the rest more than her mind needed the memory. We cannot know which of the three is true. Perhaps some quiet mixture of all of them is closest. What we can know with more confidence is that whatever pride Barbara carries from those January weeks, she carries it alone, without a plaque or a headline or so much as a mention in the laboratory newsletter, and that this is not an oversight. It is simply how the credit in this building has always been distributed. We can borrow for a moment the memory Barbara may or may not be revisiting behind her closed ledger, because it is worth telling properly at least once tonight. It is the night in late January, 9 months before this Tuesday, and the computing section is not empty the way it usually is after 5 o'clock. A dozen women, Barbara among them, are still at their desks well past dark, because a rocket carrying the country's answer to the previous autumn shock is sitting on a pad in Florida. In the laboratory's own tracking room, one floor over from where the mechanical calculators usually clatter, is filling with men listening to a radio link for a signal that will confirm or fail to confirm that the satellite has actually reached orbit. Barbara sits with her coat still on too, keyed up to have taken it off on arrival. Her final trajectory sheet already checked and rechecked twice over that afternoon. Nothing left to do now but wait alongside everyone else. The room smells of cold coffee, left too long on the burner, and the faint electricity of too many nervous people trying to look calm in the same small space. When the confirmation finally comes, well past midnight, it arrives almost anticlimactically. A man from the tracking room stepping out into the hallway and saying simply, "We have it." The tone of someone reporting a fact rather than delivering a speech. There is no cheer at first, only a long exhale that seems to move through the whole building at once, and then, a beat later, something closer to celebration does break out, quiet by the standards of celebrations elsewhere but real. Women embracing each other beside their ledgers. Someone producing a bottle that has clearly been kept in a desk drawer for exactly this possibility, a toast poured into paper cups meant for the coffee percolator. Barbara remembers, or perhaps simply imagines remembering, Mrs. Marsh, standing near the door with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was, for Mrs. Blank, Marsh, close enough to count as one watching her section, the way a conductor watches an orchestra land the final chord of a difficult piece, exactly on the beat. By the time the official announcement reaches the newspapers the following morning, the story has already reshaped itself into the version the country will keep men, in overcoats, at a Washington podium. A general and a rocket scientist shaking hands for photographers, the name of the satellite, and the names of the men who built and launched the machine carrying it. Nowhere in that morning's coverage is there a photograph of a paper cup half full of something stronger than coffee, or of a room full of women in cardigans who had spent the previous weeks making certain the numbers were right. Barbara did not expect otherwise even at the time. None of them did. But there is a version of this story, quieter than the one that made the papers, in which a dozen tired women in a converted barracks building held their breath together at midnight and then, briefly, let it out all at once. And that version is every bit as real as the one printed the next day, even though almost nobody outside that hallway will ever hear it told. Now, here is where the common picture of the space program gets corrected one more time, and it is worth saying plainly before the day closes. The men who stood at those podiums in January were not villains, and most of them would likely have said, if anyone had thought to ask, that they knew perfectly well how much of the mathematics behind them had been done by women in a converted barracks building rather than by themselves. But knowing a thing quietly and saying it publicly are two very different acts, and in 1958, almost nobody in a position to hand out credit thought to make that second act happen. The gap between what the men in the photographs knew privately and what the country was told publicly is, in its own way, the entire shape of this story. Mrs. Marsh calls the room to order in her low, unhurried way at 10 minutes to 5, reminding everyone that sheets 14 through 22 need to be complete and initialed before anyone leaves for the evening. Louise finishes her last line at 4:56, checks it twice against Francis's corrected column, and initials the bottom of sheet 22 with the small, tidy signature she has used every working day for 5 years. Around the room, the same small ritual repeats at different desks. A final figure entered, a page initialed, a sigh that is not quite a sigh so much as the sound a body makes when it finally stops holding a particular kind of attention. At 5 o'clock, without anyone announcing it, the room begins to close itself down. Dust caps, grey canvas covers, shaped to fit each machine, go over the Marchands and Friedens one by one, protecting the gears from the fine dust that drifts in through the propped windows all day. Pencils get gathered into the cup on each desk, ledgers closed and squared away in drawers that lock, though nobody at this laboratory has ever quite explained why they lock, since the numbers inside them would mean nothing to anyone who did not already know how to read them. Barbara stretches, rolling her shoulders back with a small wince. Francis gathers her coat, a good wool one she has had for years, and keeps meticulously brushed. Dot hums the last few bars of whatever she has been humming all afternoon, and finally lets the tune go quiet. Mrs. Marsh is, as always, the last one still standing at her own desk, checking that the day's work has been properly filed before she too reaches for her coat. Louise walks back down the gravel path in the last of the daylight, past the machine shops now mostly quiet, past the guard shack where a different soldier from the morning one nods at her without really looking up, and catches the bus at the same stop where she got off 8.5 hours earlier. The bus fills slowly as it winds back down out of the foothills, other laboratory workers and shop clerks and a pair of schoolteachers taking the same seats they take most evenings, a kind of unspoken community of people who share a route without ever quite becoming friends. Louise watches the streetlights along Colorado Street flicker on one at a time as the bus passes beneath them, the sky behind the San Gabriels going from amber to a deep, clear blue that this valley, before the smog thickens in later decades, still offers on a clear October evening. She collects Carol from Ruth's porch, where her daughter is sitting on the front step with a coloring book and a look of barely contained news to report, something about a boy in her class named Michael, who got sent to the principal's office for putting a frog in his desk. A story Carol tells with the kind of total narrative commitment only a 6-year-old can manage, and Louise listens to every word of it, walking the 2 blocks home, grateful in a way she does not examine too closely, for a story with no numbers in it at all. Ruth herself lingers on the porch a moment longer than usual this evening, mentioning, almost as an afterthought while she gathers Carol's coloring book and sweater, that she saw the evening paper's front page at the corner drugstore and that it mentioned the space program again. Ruth does not fully understand what her daughter does at the laboratory, has never quite understood it in 5 years despite several patient explanations, and has settled instead into a comfortable, generous pride that does not require full comprehension to be genuine. She tells Louise, as she tells her most weeks, that she doesn't know how anyone keeps all those numbers straight in her head all day. And Louise, as she does most weeks, says only that you get used to it, which is true and also not the whole truth, since getting used to something and finding it effortless are not at all the same condition. Ruth waves them off toward home, already turning back toward her own quiet house and her own evening, and Louise walks the last 2 blocks with Carol's small hand in hers, the girl narrating the frog incident for a second time with fresh embellishments that were not present in the first telling. At home, Walter is already back from Alhambra, sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper and a glass of iced tea. And the first thing Louise does on stepping through her own front door, every single evening without exception, is kick off her pumps, standing them neatly by the hall closet, and sink her stocking feet into the cool linoleum of the front hall with something close to relief. The dress code that governs her from 7:30 to 5 belongs, the moment she crosses this threshold, entirely to the laboratory again. And for the next several hours, her feet, at least, are her own. Walter's own day, when he mentions it over dinner, sounds almost restful by comparison, though he would never describe it that way himself. The shop in Alhambra has him machining small aluminum housings to tolerances he finds satisfying in their own modest way. Work he is good at, and takes quiet pride in, though nobody from Washington has ever toured his shop floor either. And he has never once expected them. He asks about Carol's day before he asks about Louise's, a habit she has always liked in him, and listens with real attention while their daughter explains, for a third time now, the precise sequence of events that led to Michael's frog crossing the classroom floor. It is, Louise thinks, watching her husband's face as he asks Carol exactly the right follow-up question, one of the quieter reasons the household holds together as well as it does, this small, consistent attention paid to whoever is speaking, regardless of whether the subject is a rocket or a frog. Dinner tonight is pork chops and boiled potatoes, a meal Louise can put together largely without thinking, her hands moving through a different kind of routine now, one that asks nothing of the careful checked precision that filled the day, but simply wants to be finished by 6:30 so that Carol can eat before her bath. Walter asks, as he asks most evenings, how the numbers went today, a question he means sincerely, though neither of them expects a detailed answer, and Louise tells him, briefly, that the section is a bit ahead of the launch schedule and that Francis found a small error before it went anywhere it could do damage. Walter nods, genuinely pleased in the mild way a tired man is pleased by news that costs him nothing to hear, and asks whether the rocket is the one aimed at the moon, because he read something about it in the paper, and Louise says yes, that one, and neither of them says much more about it, because for both of them a rocket aimed at the moon has simply become one more fact of the world they live in. Alongside the price of pork chops and the question of whether Carol has finished her arithmetic homework. The telephone rings while Louise is clearing the plates. It is her sister, Margaret, calling from her own kitchen a few miles across town, wanting to know whether Louise has finished this week's library mystery yet, because Margaret has already finished her own copy and has strong feelings she is eager to share. Louise, the cord stretched as far as it will reach, so she can keep half an eye on Carol drying the good glasses at the sink, admits she is 3 chapters from the end, and has already worked out that the detective's assistant did it, the least likely suspect, exactly as she predicted. And Margaret laughs and says she guessed the same thing by page 40, and has decided the author is either lazy or thinks his readers are. This is a familiar argument between the two of them, comfortable, and well-worn. A small, ongoing competition over who can spot a cheating author fastest. It takes up 10 unhurried minutes of the evening that have nothing whatsoever to do with rockets or ledgers or dust caps, which is precisely what makes it valuable. Margaret asks, toward the end of the call, the way she asks most weeks, whether Louise is getting enough sleep, working the hours she works, and running the house besides. And Louise says what she always says, that she manages fine, in a tone that has convinced Margaret for 5 years running, even though it has never quite convinced Louise herself. Harold's bath comes first, a small production involving a rubber duck, missing one eye, and a great deal of splashed water that Louise mops up afterward without much complaint, since a wet bathroom floor is a fair trade for a clean and tired child. Afterward, in pajamas with damp hair combed flat, Carol climbs into bed and asks, as she has taken to asking most nights this month, for the story about the rocket again, a story Louise invented herself weeks ago and has refined slightly each retelling, about a small brave ship that wants very badly to visit the moon and has to be told, very precisely, exactly which way to go, or else it will miss the moon entirely and go sailing off into the dark, where nobody could ever find it again. Carol asks, tonight as she has asked before, who tells the ship which way to go? And Louise says, as she always says, that some very careful people work it out with pencils and paper, checking their work twice, to be sure. Carol considers this with the grave seriousness of a 6-year-old encountering a genuinely interesting fact, and asks whether Louise knows any of those very careful people. Louise says that she does actually quite well, and Carol, already half asleep, seems satisfied with that answer in a way that makes Louise's chest ache pleasantly for a moment before she switches off the lamp and pulls the door most of the way shut, leaving the usual few inches open in case Carol wakes in the dark. After the dishes are done, and Carol is bathed and read to and finally asleep, Louise sits for a few minutes at the kitchen table with her own household ledger, the modest one that tracks groceries and the mortgage, and Carol's shoes, and does, by lamplight, a smaller and gentler version of the same work she did all day under fluorescent tubes. Outside, the street has gone quiet, the way residential streets in this valley go quiet by 9, porch lights switching off one by one, and above the roofline, where the smog of later decades has not yet arrived to dim it, the sky over Pasadena carries more stars than a viewer from a bigger city further east would ever expect to see. Louise does not often look up at them. Tonight, closing her small ledger and switching off the kitchen lamp, she does for just a moment, before heading to bed, and somewhere up there, invisible to the eye but entirely real, is the arc her own pencil helped describe today, one small piece of a path aimed, however improbably, at the moon. That path, and the stars Louise glances at before bed without quite meaning to, open a door onto something much larger than one household's evening. Let her step through it, because the whole world around this quiet Pasadena street is shifting faster than almost anyone inside that street has fully registered yet. A year earlier, in October of 1957, the Soviet Union placed a metal sphere the size of a beach ball into orbit around the Earth. And the effect on the United States was immediate and in its own quiet way seismic. Newspapers ran the story under enormous headlines. Families stood in backyards across the country at dusk, trying to spot a moving point of light overhead, and radios carried the satellite's steady electronic pulse, simple beeping tone that millions of Americans heard. It was not the beeping itself that unsettled people. It was what the beeping proved, which was that a rival nation had put a machine into space before the United States had, and that the rocket capable of doing so was, by extension, capable of a great deal else. The response inside laboratories like this one was immediate. Funding that had moved at a careful, deliberate pace for years suddenly moved much faster. Deadlines that would have seemed unreasonable in 1956 became routine by 1958. The small satellite that Barbara helped compute the trajectory for in January was assembled and prepared for launch in a matter of weeks, specifically because the nation needed, urgently, to answer what the Soviet Union had done. It succeeded restoring a measure of public confidence that had been badly shaken the previous autumn. And in the same season, Louise is currently living through, the American government made an even larger decision. On the 1st of October, barely 10 days before the moment we are spending with Louise tonight, a new civilian agency came into official existence in Washington, built specifically to organize the country's space efforts under one roof, rather than leaving them scattered across separate branches of the military. Everyone at the laboratory has heard the name by now. Almost nobody yet knows exactly what it will mean for their own desks, their own dust caps, their own green ledgers. The transfer of this particular laboratory from Army control into that new civilian agency has not yet happened. As Louise walks home tonight, though it is close, a matter of weeks rather than months. And when it does happen, the computing section will keep doing very much the same work under a very different letterhead. There is a second, quieter change moving through this world as well, one that will matter far more to Louise's own working life than any change of agency letterhead, and it concerns the machines rather than the government. A short drive from this laboratory, at other installations and universities around the country, a new kind of calculating device has begun to appear, one that uses electricity rather than gears, vacuum tubes, and eventually transistors rather than levers, and that can complete in seconds what takes Louise and her colleagues an entire afternoon. These electronic computers are, in the autumn of 1958, still large, expensive, and somewhat unreliable, closer in spirit to a promising experiment than a finished tool, and nobody in the computing section spends much time worrying about them yet. But the pattern, looked at from far enough away, is already visible. Within a decade, the room full of women and mechanical calculators that Louise walks into every morning will not exist in anything like its current form. The work will not disappear. It will change shape entirely. An engineer who visited a university computing center back east the previous spring described the new machines to Mrs. Marsh once in passing, over coffee, and Mrs. Beshan. Marsh repeated the description to the room afterward with a kind of bemused skepticism that made more than one woman smile. An entire machine, he had said, filled a room the size of a small house, fed not by a lever and a crank, but by punched cards stacked in trays and threaded through at speed, tended by a small staff of technicians in white coats who treated the thing with something close to reverence, keeping it cool with dedicated air conditioning, because its thousands of vacuum tubes generated more heat than the machine itself could safely tolerate. It could, this engineer claimed, complete a calculation that would take the entire computing section a full day in a matter of minutes, provided nothing about it failed first, which in 1958 it did with some regularity. Tubes burning out, cards misfeeding. Marsh's verdict, delivered without much drama, was that the machine sounded impressive and temperamental in roughly equal measure, and that she would believe it had truly replaced careful human arithmetic when it had gone a full month without needing a repairman. Nobody in the room disagreed with her that morning. Most of them, whether they knew it yet or not, would spend a good part of the next decade learning to work alongside exactly that kind of machine instead of against it. What is worth noting here, gently, because it is easy to tell this part of the story as a simple tragedy, and it is not quite that simple, is what actually happened to the women who did this work by hand. Some, it is true, left the field entirely once the mechanical calculators and slide rules gave way to something else, unable or unwilling to retrain their specific skill, rendered obsolete almost overnight, the way skills sometimes are when a new machine arrives. But a good number of women who spent these years bent over green ledgers went on to become, within just a few more years, the country's first computer programmers in the modern sense of that word. Women who had already spent a decade thinking in exactly the disciplined, step-by-step, error-checking terms that early programming demanded. To their own surprise in some cases, that the electronic machine was simply a faster version of the same careful thinking they had been doing all along with a pencil. Barbara in particular, though she does not know it yet on this October evening, will spend much of the next decade doing exactly that, trading her Marchant for a key-punch machine and finding, somewhat to her own delight. For Louise, tonight, none of this is yet a lived reality. It sits ahead of her, unannounced, the way most large historical shifts sit ahead of the people living through their early tremors, felt more as a change in atmosphere than as a specific, dated event. She knows the new agency exists. She has heard talk of electronic machines somewhere back east. She does not yet know that within a few years her own daughter, Carol, now 6 years old and currently asleep down the hall, with a coloring book still open on her nightstand, will grow up in a world where the word computer means, first and primarily, a machine, and where the fact that it once meant a woman with a pencil will have to be explained, patiently, to people who assume it was always the other way around. That explanation, in its own small way, is part of why we are spending this evening with Louise at all. The difficult autumn Barbara's January success helped erase from the country's memory deserves a moment of its own here, because it explains why that success mattered so much, and why the room Louise works in carries a weight that a casual visitor would never guess from the calm clatter of the calculators. The previous December, barely 10 months before this Tuesday, the United States had attempted its own first satellite launch, a rocket called Vanguard, in front of assembled television cameras and a watching public still raw from the shock of the Soviet satellite 2 months earlier. The rocket rose perhaps 4 feet off its pad before losing thrust and collapsing back down in a fireball, in full view of the cameras, in full view of the country. Newspapers overseas were not gentle about it. One dubbed it Flopnik. Another called it Kaputnik. It was by any measure a public humiliation, broadcast live, with no way to soften it after the fact. The small satellite that the computing section rushed to prepare through January of 1958, the one whose trajectory Barbara helped calculate, existed largely because that December failure demanded an answer, quickly, from a different rocket and a different team. Drawn from the Army's own rocket program, with this laboratory supplying the science and the guidance work. Its success in January did not erase the Vanguard failure from history, but it did something almost as important. It told a frightened country that the failure had not been the whole story. This laboratory, and the room where Louise sits, was never the only place where this kind of labor happened, and it is worth widening the frame for a moment before we return to her for the rest of the evening. Across the country, at a government research center in Virginia that had spent 2 decades studying aircraft before it was folded into the same new civilian space agency taking shape this October. A comparable computing pool had operated since the years before this war, staffed by women mathematicians. Dry liability, a willingness to work for less than a man would accept. By the 1,950 seconds that Virginia Laboratory's computing work included a group of black women mathematicians hired into a section kept physically separate from their white colleagues, eating at separate tables and using separate restrooms under the same segregation laws that governed the rest of the state. Separation that applied to where a woman could sit and never once applied to the accuracy of the mathematics she produced. The story we are telling tonight, of brilliant, careful, uncredited work sitting underneath a triumph the country was allowed to see, repeated itself, with its own local cruelties layered on top in laboratories like that one as well. We mention it here not to wander from Louise's own Tuesday, but because her Tuesday was never really a single, isolated story. It was one visible thread in a much larger, mostly invisible fabric, stretched across an entire country of women doing this exact kind of thinking, under this exact kind of constraint, for the same government reaching toward the same stars. There is one more piece of this story worth telling honestly before we step back to look at the whole shape of the day, because a channel that only tells you about triumphs is not being entirely honest with you. And Louise's own arithmetic deserves better than a tidy ending invented for comfort. The very probe that has been quietly hurrying the pace of this computing section all Tuesday, the one Louise has spent 8 hours helping guide toward the moon, will lift off from Cape Canaveral within days of this evening, and it will not reach its destination. A problem in the rocket's own upper stage, a shutdown arriving a few seconds earlier than planned, will leave it short of the speed it needed, and instead of passing the moon, it will climb to a remarkable height, tens of thousands of miles, higher than any American object has yet traveled, before gravity wins and pulls it back down into the atmosphere, where it burns away entirely a little more than 2 days after launch. It will not be remembered as a failure exactly. It will be remembered by the people who worked on it as a real step, a great deal learned, a height reached that nobody had reached before, even short of the goal. But it will not be the triumphant photograph in the following morning's paper. We tell you this now, gently, not to undercut anything you have felt tonight about Louise or Barbara or the room they work in, but because it points at something worth sitting with quietly before we let this day close. Louise's arithmetic, when the numbers finally come back from Cape Canaveral, will very likely be found correct. The mistake, if there is one, will not belong to the computing section at all. It will belong to a valve, or a switch, or a few seconds of burn time in a rocket stage built by an entirely different team in an entirely different building. Precision of the kind Louise practices cannot control everything it touches. It can only guarantee its own small portion of a much larger machine, and hope that every other portion, built and tested by other hands, holds up its own end as faithfully. It may be the largest thing an honest person can promise about their own work in any decade. I did my part correctly. What happens next is not fully mine to answer for. Let us step back now from this one Tuesday, from sheet 14, and the dust caps and the pork chops cooling on the stove, and look at the whole shape of the day from a slight distance, the way you might step back from a large canvas to see the picture. A few patterns emerge when you do this, patterns that belong not only to Louise Whitfield and her own desk in her own building, but to a great many rooms like it, in a great many decades, wherever careful, unglamorous labor has been asked to disappear into the achievement it makes possible. The first pattern is the invisibility of labor that succeeds too quietly to be noticed. Think of Barbara this afternoon, sitting for a moment with her pencil down, the memory of January passing through her without a single outward sign of it. Think of the newspaper photographers who walked past the computing section's door the previous spring without once opening it. This is not a story about villains hiding credit on purpose, not most of the time. It is something quieter and in some ways more troubling than deliberate theft. Work that goes right, work that never produces a dramatic failure worth investigating, simply stops being visible as work at all. A rocket that reaches the moon becomes in the retelling the achievement of the men who designed and built and launched it, not because anyone decided to erase the women who calculated its path, but because success has a way of collapsing backward into a single, simple story, and the simple story rarely has room for a room full of quiet women with pencils. The lesson here is not really about 1958. It is about how every achievement any of us will ever witness rests on a foundation of labor that succeeded so completely it left no trace for us to notice. The second pattern is the way precision, real precision, the kind that gets a rocket to the moon rather than into the ocean, is not a gift some people simply have and others lack. It is built continuously out of redundancy and humility. Remember Frances at Mrs. Marsh's desk this afternoon, finding her own transposed digit and correcting it without a flicker of wounded pride. Remember that the entire architecture of the computing section rests on the assumption that any single person, however skilled, will occasionally err, and that the only real defense against error is not genius, but structure. Two independent columns of arithmetic checked against each other until they agree. There is something worth carrying out of this room and into an ordinary life here, which is that the people who do the most reliable work are rarely the ones who insist they never make mistakes. They are the ones who built a system generous enough to catch the mistakes everyone makes and humble enough to use it without flinching. The third pattern is the one hiding inside Louise's own morning, in the 4:45 wake-up, and the 2 lunches packed before 6, and the quiet, unspoken accounting she keeps with her mother down the street. Call it the density of obligation that falls, disproportionately, on women who work. Louise's working day does not begin at 7:30 and end at 5. It begins in the dark with a bathroom schedule negotiated years ago and never revisited, and it does not end until the household ledger is closed and the kitchen lamp switched off long after Walter has finished his own newspaper and his own iced tea. Nobody assigned Louise this second shift in so many words. It simply accumulated around her the way water finds the low ground, because the world Louise lives in has decided, without much discussion, that a woman's professional precision and a woman's domestic responsibility are 2 entirely separate obligations that happen to occupy the same 24 hours. The fourth pattern sits in the cost of stockings and the cut of a skirt, in the fact that Louise's professional competence has always had to arrive wearing a very specific, carefully maintained costume in order to be taken seriously at all. Call it the economics of appearance, the invisible tax we noticed earlier tonight, the hours and dollars spent simply proving, through fabric and posture and a carefully judged shade of lipstick misses. Marsh would find acceptable that a woman doing serious work is still, first and always, a proper woman. No man in the engineering building 100 yards away has ever once had to think about whether his trousers communicate the correct amount of seriousness. The unfairness here is not loud. It rarely is. It shows up instead as a quiet, constant background tax paid in small sums on top of every other kind of labor already being performed. And the fifth pattern, the one that perhaps explains all the others, is the gap between capability and permission. Louise has never once, in 5 years, submitted work that needed correcting by anyone above her own careful eye and Frances's independent check. She is, by any honest measure, exactly as capable as the junior male engineers earning a third again what she earns, sitting in design meetings she is never invited to attend. What separates her from them is not skill. It is a classification on a personnel form, a category invented before she was ever hired, that decided in advance how far her considerable capability would be permitted to carry her. This is, in the end, the pattern beneath every other pattern tonight. Not an absence of talent, an absence of permission for that talent to be called what it actually was. Across Pasadena tonight, in small houses, much like the Whitfields, the rest of the computing section is settling into its own version of this same quiet hour. Frances has come home to her rented house near the Rose Bowl, brushed her good wool coat and hung it carefully, and sits now with a cup of tea and the radio turned low, the solitude of her evening neither sad nor triumphant, simply hers, earned through years of learning how to hold a life steady on her own terms. Barbara is 2 miles away in the small apartment she shares with another young woman from the laboratory, replaying, perhaps, some fragment of the man from Washington's visit, or perhaps thinking of nothing at all beyond the pleasant, uncomplicated tiredness of a day's work honestly done. Mrs. Marsh, wherever she goes, at the end of these days, a life about which the rest of the section knows almost nothing, has presumably done what she does every evening, which is stop thinking about sheet 14 through sheet 22 the moment she locks the office door, trusting the ritual of tomorrow morning to take care of whatever the ritual of tonight has earned its rest from. None of these women know, as they drift towards sleep on this ordinary Tuesday, exactly how history will eventually describe this small, ordinary stretch of their working lives. Most of them, if asked, would probably say there was nothing much to describe. That, too, is worth remembering, gently, as we get ready to leave them for the night. It is past 10 now in the small stucco bungalow on the Whitfield street, and the house has gone as quiet as a house with a 6-year-old in it ever fully goes, which is to say, nearly quiet, with the occasional soft creak of Carol turning over in her sleep down the hall and the low, steady tick of the same kind of wall clock that hangs above the door of the computing section, though this one keeps a gentler kind of time, marking nothing more urgent than the hour Louise and Walter finally climb into their own bed. Walter is asleep within minutes, the plain, uncomplicated sleep of a man who used his hands well today and expects to use them well again tomorrow. Louise lies awake a little longer. She often does, not troubled exactly, simply still turning something over, the way a mind trained for 8 hours a day to check its own work has trouble fully switching that habit off at the door. On the nightstand beside her, closed for the night, sits the same small black notebook that held this morning's assignment in her own careful hand. Tomorrow's page is already partly written, has been since Friday, in truth, a Wednesday's worth of work, waiting patiently in the dark for her to wake and begin it, sheet 23, through whatever the day requires next. The same green ledger, the same careful checking, the day beginning again in outline before today. There is something almost comforting in that circularity, Louise has found over the years, the sense that the work simply continues, patient and steady, regardless of what any single day brings, the way a river keeps its own course, regardless of which leaves happen to be floating on its surface on any given Tuesday. Outside, the street is dark and mostly silent, one dog barking somewhere several yards over before giving up and going quiet again. The streetlights Louise watched flicker on from the bus, now holding their steady amber glow over empty sidewalks. Above the roofline, the sky has gone fully dark, and the stars Louise noticed earlier from the kitchen window are still there, patient and indifferent, holding their positions the way they have held them for longer than anyone in this house can meaningfully imagine, waiting, as they always do, for the next careful hand to come along and work out, in pencil, exactly how to reach them. We will leave Louise here in the dark, in the ordinary, unremarked upon peace of a Tuesday, well spent, a rocket's fate resting partly in her steady hand, and entirely out of her control by morning, both of those things true at once without contradiction. There is something to be said, tonight and every night, for people who do their work honestly and let the rest of the world sort out the credit however it sees fit. Somewhere above Pasadena, past the amber streetlights, dark hills, and the quiet waiting stars, a rocket is being readied that a woman with a sharpened pencil helped aim, and whether or not it reaches the moon, the arithmetic that carries it there Bob been done exactly right by hands the history books mostly forgot to mention. Nothing about tonight will make the papers. No photographer will crouch outside a small stucco bungalow to capture a woman named Louise Whitfield sleeping soundly beside her husband. A green ledger closed on the kitchen table, a notebook waiting on the nightstand with tomorrow's task already written in a careful, tidy hand. That is exactly as it should be, and exactly as it always was. The quiet ones rarely get the photograph. They get, instead, the simple, durable knowledge that the work was done honestly, and that somewhere above a sleeping city, a path through the dark was measured out correctly, one small number at a time. Wherever you are tonight, whatever hour your own clock is keeping, thank you for spending it in that quiet room with Louise, Barbara, and Francis, in a place that mattered more than almost anyone the time understood. The fire has burned down to its last coals. The story is finished. But the people were real, and they lived, and now you have spent an evening in their world. That is something worth having. Sleep well.